All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to check out great theories of everything, other tidbits and important things that you may not know because they're kind of obscure, things off the beaten path, but things that if you knew about them, they would transform your life in positive ways. And we're going to try to get right into it right as soon as we can here. This is episode 184 of the Reciprocal Church, where we're trying to assemble documents that have spiritual meaning to kind of reconstruct a religion that we feel like is going to be needed after the collapse of all the Western religions, after it's discovered that their documents, their scriptures, have been severely tampered with in some cases, in other cases, a psyop from the very start. And so we're trying to decode a lot of the New Testament. We're going to start a decode of the book of Luke, what we call the Flavian signature. After the name given by Joseph Atwill, also covering the work of Michael Menescatz. We're also trying to assemble other ways besides that Flavian signature decode or cipher to also decode. And one very interesting approach is through the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you may know were discovered in the mid-20th century in some caves outside of Qumran, 20 miles from Jerusalem. And they are from an ancient Jewish sect, strict religionists who wrote all these things down, several hundred works, including every book from the Old Testament, except for Esther, and also many of the apocryphal books of the Old Testament, and much sectarian material that is specific to their sect. And these things shed a great amount of light on the New Testament. And the thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they were discovered, really, what is it now, almost 80 years ago, 70 to 80 years ago. But we really haven't figured out what they say yet, because the international team of scholars that was appointed to look at these things dropped the ball as soon as they figured out that they didn't say what they wanted them to say, because they were a bunch of Catholic priests and they were expecting all of their beliefs to be validated by the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were not. And so they started just kind of pretending to go through them and come up with subjects to write books on, but they really didn't reveal what was there. They kind of kicked the can down the road for about 35 years, and it wasn't until the early 90s that these became well known. And by that time, most of the people that were all salivating over getting their hands on these things were already dead or old. And so the new generation didn't really know what they were looking for or why these were important, and they weren't, enthusiastic about getting into them. And so, but one of the most influential figure in getting the scrolls to be divulged was Robert Eisenman, who was a professor at one of the Cal State schools, and he kind of came down and threatened legal action, among other things, to get these pictures of a lot of these scrolls taken. And he has decided, after going through all of them, as well as many of the other apocryphal texts and other ancient texts, along with the Bible, that the Dead Sea Scrolls change everything. And so I think it is worthy of our attention. But then, there's also the Joseph Atwill approach. Now, there's got to be a way to kind of reconcile those things. And I think we're going to be trying to dig that out. But so we have been looking at his book that was called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. But we're going to change over to one that is more directly related to New Testament scholarship, which is the New Testament Code. Now, this book is like 1,000 pages, but the introduction, what he calls preliminaries, is highly explosive. We're going to check out the last 2 sections of that. Hopefully, we can get to the end of the first section today and the second section tomorrow. But this is, Eisenman's take of all of the scriptures that he's read, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the New Testament, the Old Testament, also the ancient Hebrew Apocrypha, the Nag Hammadi texts, which are New Testament Apocrypha, and all of the classic authors, the church fathers all the way from the 1st century up until now. And so this is this guy just pretty much downloading everything that he knows. And I was trying to read some of this earlier, and it was like one sentence. There were like 4 or 5 sets of parentheses in one sentence. And it's just like you can't keep up. But because it's so full of juicy evidence, and it's not always like evidence, it can be conjecture as well. But we're going to read this section here called Manaen, M-A-N-A-E-N, the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. Now you remember that the Herods were the puppet kings of Judea, hired by the Caesars to kind of look after this Roman colony called Palestine. And in the 1st century, 1st century BC was the beginning of the Herods, and there was not just one of them, as sometimes the Bible, implies, but there were a couple dozen of them, and most of them were hated. There were a couple of them that were liked apparently by the Jews, but they were not. They were really of Arabian descent, or half Arabian and half Greek. And they claim to have converted to Judaism, but that's debatable. I'm not sure that any of them were circumcised. I guess we'll see. But so this section is Manaen, the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. This brings us to the 4th person mentioned in Acts 13, verse 1, preceding Saulos. And just before Saulos is renamed Paulos in Acts 13:9, the 5th among these prophets and teachers of the Antioch assembly that he introduced earlier in this chapter. Manaen, the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. This is one of the most revealing testimonies in New Testament scripture, because it unequivocally, and one might say even unashamedly, reveals that there were Herodians involved, that is of the family of Herod, Herodians involved in the foundation of the church at Antioch, which is in Syria, which is where disciples were first called Christians, apparently around 55 AD. This is no insignificant datum. In his earlier book, in my book, James, the Brother of Jesus, I expressed the opinion that what one has in such instances is a species of shell game. We identified this sort of shell game with regard to the central triad of the Jerusalem church, depending on which source and whose brother one is talking about. Peter, James, and John, his brother. John, his brother, in quotes. Peter, James, and John, his brother, in the Gospels, and, quote, James, Cephas, and John in Galatians. So In the Gospels, it's Peter, James, and John, his brother. And in Galatians, it's James, Cephas, or Peter, James, Cephas, and John in Galatians. In the manner in which these central three are presented in the Gospels, the most famous James appears to be the brother of John. And therefore, one ends up with the well-known John and James, the two sons of Zebedee, or the two sons of thunder, the thunder twins, however one wishes to express it, none of which formulations appears historically very realistic. It only takes a little reconstruction to arrive at the Cephas John and James his brother, meaning James the brother of the Lord, as the central three, according to Paul's testimony in Galatians 1, verse 19, and Galatians 2, verse 9. The epithet his brother would then no longer apply to James, the brother of John, a character nowhere mentioned by Paul, but rather, and this probably more accurately, James, the brother of Jesus. This was obviously how Paul saw it, and because of this, made no mention of any James other than the brother of the Lord, and seems to know no other. This would appear to be the thrust of most traditional extra-biblical literature too, where more is known about James the Just, or James the brother of Jesus, than someone called James the brother of John, as in Mark 3, verse 17, and 5, verse 37, unless John and the Lord can be considered to mean the same thing, a dubious proposition. Okay, I'm pretty lost with all that, but I probably have to write it down and make a chart. But I think he kind of resolves a lot of it as we move on. Well, he also says, to be fair, in Galatians 1:19, he is only referred to as James, the brother of the Lord. In any event, this other James, the brother of John, historical or otherwise, conveniently disappears from Scripture in Acts 12, verse 2, just prior to Acts' introduction of this other James in James 12, verse 17. This disappearance of James, the brother of John, consonant with the sudden appearance of the really significant James just a few lines later, offhand or otherwise, is, from the standpoint of early church history in Palestine, the really significant information as well. This James appears, as it were, unheralded and unintroduced, though the text appears to think we already know or should know who he is. I pretty much just think conspiracy all along the way right here, where they're just making it so confused, like he says, a shell game. They're making it so confusing that you can't quite keep track of who it is, but they're really setting up a riddle so that if you do figure it out, you get to the next level of the code. Okay, the same is true of the reference to one, quote, Manaen, the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch, as one of the principal members of the founding community at Antioch in Acts 13, verse 1. We shall have more to say about which Antioch is intended here in due course. As if things aren't complicated enough, there's more than one Antioch, or several of them. But Manaen is probably defective, as there is no other known personality with such a name in any source one can point to, unless it be Mani, a century or two later. Rather, the appellation, as it stands in Acts, probably represents a corruption of the Ananias, as opposed to Manaen, Ananias, we have already met above, who forms a set piece of the presentation of Paul's conversion in Damascus in Acts 9, verses 12 verses 12 to 17. In this sense, Damascus in Acts can simply be seen as a parallel to or write-in for Edessa, Edessa, and what is going on there at about this time, or even possibly Adiabene in Josephus, all fairly contiguous areas. So, Eisenman is really trying to deconstruct and reconstruct all of these different names in this shell game. Names of cities: Antioch and Damascus, Edessa, Adiabene, and also then, Peter, Paul, and John, James, the brother of Jesus, and so on. And this other character, Manaen. The same can probably be said for a certain Mnason, mentioned further along in Acts 21, verse 16, at the time of Paul's climactic final encounter with James. That's spelled Mnason. Not only do we have the telltale certain or someone preceded, the adjective, the certain or someone in this designation, but and I have seen other texts say, when you see those words, certain or someone, like that, a certain such and such, that's a trigger that you're supposed to look for a code. So a certain or someone in this designation, but once again, the picturesque description of him as an old disciple, quote, an old disciple, a Cypriot, who, for some unexplained reason, has a house in Jerusalem where Paul and his companions stayed. He may constitute a variation on Ananias above as well, or, for that matter, some other unidentified personage, as, once again, there is no one by this name in any other historical context from this period one can specify. Properly speaking, the character being referred to in multiple contexts as Ananias probably should have been mentioned among the prophets and teachers of the Antioch assembly anyhow, whichever the Antioch one might have in mind at this time. Though Acts places him in Damascus, quote, he or a namesake of his is clearly functioning, according to Eusebius's source, in Edessa, where he is associated with the conversion of the king there, Agbaras, or Abgarus, the great king of the peoples beyond the Euphrates, quote. Also in Josephus's account of the conversion of Queen Helen, possibly one of Agbaras's wives, and her favorite son Izates, at the beginning of the all-important Book 20 of the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, ending with the death of James. Yet another character called Ananias is to be met in two locales, once in the south at the mouth of the Tigris at Charax Spasini, modern-day Basra, and following this on the upper Euphrates closer to Edessa, or the land of the Edessenes, possibly including Adiabene adjoining it. Nor do we consider all of these to be separate renderings or episodes. The women, such as Helen, in this great king's harem, also possibly his sister or half-sister, as, say, Sarah was supposed to have been Abraham's, whom Ananias and another companion Josephus mysteriously declines to mention, get in among and convert, quote, have a horror of circumcision, end quote. This last, in turn, is perhaps the principal issue behind Paul's polemics in Galatians, a letter being addressed seemingly to those in either a northern Syrian or an Asian context. This is perhaps why Abraham plays such an important role in its polemics, not those only directed against erstwhile companions, but also those in the letter of James, in some respects its ostensible answer, Abraham himself being celebrated as having originated in this area. This is also true of the derivative later polemics in the Quran. To go back to the Herod the Tetrarch, to whom this Manaean is supposed to have stood in quasi-fraternal relationship, not only is this Herod well known as the eventual husband of the sister of King Agrippa I, Herodias, but he or she would seem to bear much of the responsibility for the death of John the Baptist, whichever presentation of these events one chooses to follow, either that of the Gospels or of Josephus. It is hardly credible that an individual with such a background and called therefore the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch could have been reckoned among the founding prophets and teachers of the church at Antioch, as Acts would have it, unless the apposition were accidentally or purposefully displaced, which is what we meant by alluding to a shell game in the first place, and it rather applied not to an insignificant unknown such as Manaean, but rather to Paul himself. I have expressed the position, which we shall develop in much greater detail in due course below, that Paul was a Herodian, one of the proofs of which were his greetings to his kinsman Herodian, quote, kinsman Herodian, which he says means the littlest Herod, at the end of Romans 16:11. Presumably Herod VI, the son of Aristobulus and Salome, to whose household he appears already to have sent greetings in the previous line. And the Salome in question is, of course, the very person whose dance is pictured in the synoptic gospels as being the immediate cause of John the Baptist's demise, a dance never mentioned in Josephus, though her marriage to another of her mother's uncles, Philip, is. In the synoptics, this Philip evolves into her mother's first husband. An individual Josephus rather identifies as actually having been named Herod, not Philip. In Josephus, it is rather Salome's husband, as we just said, who is named Philip, who died childless. As it turns out, just such a relative of Herod the Tetrarch, elsewhere called Herod Antipas, named Saulos, just such a relative of Herod the Tetrarch named Saulos does exist in the Herodian family at this time. Furthermore, as described by Josephus, he is involved in activities not unsimilar, as we shall see, to Paul's as well, namely leading a riot in Jerusalem after the death of James, perilously similar to the riot led by Paul, described in Acts 8, verses 1 through 3, directly following the stoning of Stephen, or the riot which Paul described as the enemy, is pictured as leading in the pseudo-Clementine recognitions that ends up in James being thrown not from the pinnacle of the temple, but headlong down the steps. Okay, so that pseudo-Clementine recognitions is I don't know, I believe it's a Nag Hammadi text, but it might not even be that. It's apocryphal New Testament, and talks about the early first century, group of Christians. And so according to the pseudo-Clementine, they refer to Paul as the enemy, or according to Eisenman, they refer to Paul as the enemy, and he doesn't get thrown out the window or thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, but instead he gets thrown headlong down the steps. He is also involved, like his namesake Paul, this is this character Saulos, like his namesake Paul, in an appeal to Caesar, in both Nero Caesar But more about all these things in due course. And, there's certainly Voskulin and Sheldon have a book called Operation Mind Control, where they believe that Paul was an agent of Nero, or I guess possibly Claudius, but probably more likely Nero, that he was kind of like a spy, an intelligent agent. And he was tasked to kind of, distract the Jewish zealots. If Paul, and not Manaen, was the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch, identical with the individual called Saulos in the Josephus, it would not be at all surprising if he were also involved earlier in his career in the death of John the Baptist and his flight from Damascus at this time, as per the picture in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 32 to 33, not the sanitized and refurbished one in Acts 9, verse 23. In order to escape the soldiers of King Aretas related to these circumstances. The circumstances were that this Paul, or Saulos, was in Damascus, the real Damascus, and not the more complex one in the scrolls, or the one revised in Acts 9, verses 2 to 25, on a mission of some sort in support of his kinsman or foster brother Herod the Tetrarch, the recently acquired husband of the despised Herodias, the marriage of whom triggered the death of John. Actually, Aretas, the Arab king of Petra, farther south, had just taken military control of Damascus at this time. To put this more succinctly, if we sometimes consider constructs like the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch to be laterally displaced, we can arrive with far more sense at the insight that in the early Christian community at Antioch, whichever Antioch, where Christians were first called Christians, the individual brought up with Herod the Tetrarch was Paul, not Manaen. Precisely that Saulos, who 8 lines further along in Acts 13, verse 7, receives his Greco-Latin name after a far too felicitous exchange with Sergius Paulus, pictured as the Roman proconsul of Cyprus at this time. Elsewhere, Paul is pictured as having made the assertion of having persecuted the followers of the way unto death, as in Acts 22, verse 4, and Galatians 1, verse 13 and 23. This is just the conclusion we would arrive at in our interpretation of the curious double version of Paul's descent down the walls of Damascus in a basket to escape the representatives of King Aretas trying to arrest him in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 32 and 33. Via the miracle of art, Acts 9, verse 23 refurbishes this, while at the same time injecting another fairly virulent dose of Hellenistic anti-Semitism into a descent by Paul down the walls of Damascus in a basket to escape the Jews. It is now the Jews who are presented as the ones who want to kill him, and not the ethnarch of Aretas, as in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 32 above. In fact, a monarch, and so when I see that, when I see the anti-Semitism, Hellenistic anti-Semitism, that's the Romans. That's what I think, is it that this was, either, written by the Romans, or at least they altered the script, and they wrote that part out of the script. They said that he was escaping the Jews as opposed to this ethnarch of Aretas. In fact, a monarch by the name of Aretas did play a role in the circumstances surrounding John the Baptist's death. But he was on the same side as John because Herod the Tetrarch, Herod in the Gospels, had divorced his original wife to prepare the way for his marriage to Agrippa the First's sister and Salome's mother Herodias. As Josephus puts it in the Antiquities, the people were glad at Herod's discomfiture and the subsequent mini-war he fought with Aretas over this affair, and took it as a sign of God's vengeance or pleasure at what he, Herod, had done to John. In addition, it is apparent that the Jews in Josephus's diverging account were on the same side as John and not against him, as the Gospels often portray. John being a popular religio-political reformer for the mass of Jews who, according to Josephus, seemed willing to do anything he should suggest, quote, including revolution, while on the other hand, the Herodians were a Greco-Arab alien dynasty imposed on them by the Romans from outside, most of whom not even considered as Jews. This is backed up as well by later Syriac Armenian sources, which claim, reliably or not, that their ruler Agbar helped Aretas in his campaign against Herod Antipas, or Herod the Tetrarch. The individual we are supposed to think had a foster brother among the earliest prophets and teachers of the Christian assembly at Antioch named Manaen. Once again, our suggestion is that the actual foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch was not Manaen, but Paul himself, which makes perfectly good sense in the context. This is particularly true when one considers Paul's Roman citizenship, which all Herodians possessed, his consistently pro-Roman orientation, both as pictured in Acts and in his letters, his easy entree as a young man into Jerusalem upper-class circles, including the letters he gets from the high priest to arrest those of the way in Damascus, to say nothing of the case with which his nephew later is able to communicate with the chief captain of the Roman guard in the temple who is holding Paul in protective custody, and finally his incarceration in Herod's palace in Caesarea, that's Agrippa II, in what appears rather a loose form of house arrest than an actual incarceration in Acts 23, verse 35. All right, there's a lot there. You might want to put me on very slow speed and make some charts, genealogical charts or whatever. But anyway, that will do it for today. We're going to take over right here tomorrow. And so thanks for tuning in today.